Our guest this evening is award-winning writer and filmmaker David Bezmozgis. His previous works, Natasha and Other Stories, which is currently being adapted into a film, and his film Victoria Day, and the novel The Free World, probe similar themes to The Betrayers, namely exile, immigration, and identity, especially of Russian Jews. It's a subject close to Bezmozgis' heart, since his family emigrated from Latvia to Canada when he was 6 years old. Listed as one of the New Yorker's top 20 fiction writers under 40, David Bezmozgis has been garlanded with prizes including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and Governor General's Award, and both of his books have been New York Times notables. Here this evening to get the conversation off the ground is Michael Ray, editor of Francis Coppola's story and art quarterly Zoetrope All Story, winner of the 2012 National Magazine Award for Fiction, and a screenwriter whose films have been selected for the Venice, Telluride, and Toronto Film Festivals, among others. Please give it up for David Bezmozgis and Michael Ray.
Well, thanks to everybody for coming, and thanks to the JCC for hosting. You guys always do such great programming, and I'm grateful for you guys compelling a good friend to come in town so I can see him again. So let's start at the beginning and of The Betrayers, and can you sort of set the stage and tell us about Kotler and the sort of predicament in which he finds himself as the book opens?
So, yes, as the book opens, the main character is a man named Baruch Kotler, who is now an Israeli politician, who before he was an Israeli politician had been a famous refusnik dissident that spent time in the Gulag. And he finds himself in this predicament where he's in government, he's a minister in the Israeli government, and the prime minister has decided to unilaterally withdraw from a West Bank settlement. And Kotler opposes this idea for his own reasons, which become clear in the book. However, he's also vulnerable, and he's presented with some blackmail, essentially. A shady sort of character calls him, and they meet in the park behind the Israel Museum, and this man says, either you cooperate and just be quiet and go along with this thing, or we have some information on you. We'll make life hard on you. And he knows essentially what it is that he's being threatened with, but he refuses this bargain. And the very next morning, photographs are plastered all over the newspapers of every Israeli newspaper of him and his young mistress, a woman named Leora, who's also the daughter of refusniks who now live in Israel. And off they go to Yalta in Crimea, where Kotler had very fond memories of vacationing as a boy. And
yeah, I think that sort of transitions to a really lovely scene in the story, which I think evidences your really acute observation of human character, and I think that's where you're going to read.
Yeah, okay. I'll read a little bit. So they go to Yalta in the Crimea, and it's August, it's high season. And so the city's very busy. And because he'd made this reservation very quickly, they show up and they're informed that their room is actually not available. They've lost their reservation. And so Kotler and Leora have to decide what they're going to do next, and they go to the bus station where they encounter people who are just locals who are offering rooms for rent. And I'll just read the scene where they end up deciding where they're going to stay. So I'll do it here. While they were speaking, Kotler noticed that some of the people had taken a keener interest in them, as if having picked up the scent. When Kotler and Leora started toward the group, two people separated themselves from the others and stepped forward to meet them. They did not appear to be in league, rather at odds. Both were middle-aged women, and each held a hand-lettered sign advertising accommodations. The one who took the lead was stouter and darker complexioned. Her hair had been cut short and dyed an unnatural shade of burgundy. Her features were regular, the eyes, Kotler noticed, a striking dark blue, and though her skin had thickened with age, he imagined that she had been alluring in her day. The second woman was short, shorter than the first, and appreciably shorter even than the diminutive Kotler. She was sinewy, the twin points of her collarbones jutting from the top of her summer frock. She was younger than the first woman by as much as a decade, her hair longer, wheat-colored, and undyed. Whereas ethnically, the first woman was harder to place. I feel like I missed something here. Did I miss the part? Oh yes, I'm coming. There it is. Here we go. It's coming. Okay. By decade. Each woman wore a small gold Orthodox cross around her neck. That's actually very important. Okay. Whereas ethnically, the first woman was harder to place, the second had the snub features of a Russian peasant. Yes. The old game of deducing ethnicity. In this, they were all participants, experts. Are you looking for a room? The first woman inquired. We are, Kotler replied. For how long? The week. I have it. If you'll come with me, I can show you. Why should he go with you? The second woman protested. I also have a room, and more convenient, closer to the beach. Let's ask the client what he wants. Here's the difference between my room and hers, the first woman said. Hers may be closer to the beach by 5 minutes, but it is smaller and lacks a private bath. So it depends what you want. In my experience, people today prefer to have a private bath. And the price, Kotler asked. Whatever she offers you, the first woman said, I will match it. And the others, Kotler said, regarding those who had remained in place and who, in the shade of the glass and concrete hulk of the terminal, followed their conversation with a flat, disconsolate interest. You're welcome to talk to them, but none of them will offer you anything better. And besides, do you have the time to see every place? Why not come with me? I believe you will be satisfied, but if not, you can come back and try with someone else. As usual, Svetlana, you're very aggressive, the other woman said. Pardon, madame, Svetlana replied, the French words heavily accented with Russian. Exactly who's being aggressive? You have some nerve to insult me in front of clients. It's correct that my room doesn't have a private bath, the second woman said to Kotler and Leora, making a point of ignoring Svetlana, but I wouldn't call it smaller. It is also clean and newly renovated. My husband, a qualified carpenter, did the work himself, and it is much closer to the beach and the bus station. In the interest of saving time, why not come see it first? To go with her will take you twice as long. Kotler exchanged a quick look with Leora to ascertain her opinion. What he saw from her was mostly demurral, abstention from the vote. Where are you from? Svetlana asked, thrusting herself more completely in front of the other woman. America, Kotler said, and flashed another glance at Leora. Are you Jews? Svetlana asked ingratiatingly, in a tone Kotler had never much liked. Do you ask this question of all your clients? My husband is Jewish, Svetlana stated, as though it were an article of pride. Oh, and what of it? The second woman declared, stepping around Svetlana. Maybe my grandfather was a Jew. If you're Jews, Svetlana continued, you will understand what life is like for us here. Now you're Jewish too? The second woman scoffed. It's news to me. Well, if you're so Jewish, what are you still doing here? The other Jews, those with any sense, skipped off to Israel at the first opportunity. You see what we have to put up with, Svetlana said contemptuously. Is your husband from here? Kotler asked. No, from Kazakhstan, Svetlana said, and added defensively, there are many Jews from Kazakhstan. Well, I suppose it's better here than in Kazakhstan, Kotler said. If you have to struggle for your daily bread, it makes little difference, Kazakhstan or Crimea. Kotler turned once more to Leora. He now had no trouble discerning her mind. He could tell that she disapproved of his inclination. She was savvy, disdainful of risk, and far less sentimental than he. Without a doubt, hers was the more prudent course, but he had never been good at stifling the contrarian part of his nature, and he was much too old to undertake a transformation. Doesn't it say in the Torah that you should first help your own kind? Svetlana pronounced. Does it? Kotler replied. But he had already made his decision, and even this comment didn't cause him to revise it. He gripped the handle of his suitcase and tipped the bag so that it rested on its little wheels. Reluctantly, Leora did the same. "Very well," Kotler said to Svetlana, "after you." So that's the beginning.
And so what follows is a chance encounter that commences the book's second act, and that's so sort of unlikely and yet inevitable that it has the characters discussing the role of fate. And Kotler has a view of fate that allows room for free will, where he says that it pulls and we choose whether or not to follow. And so is that your view? Do you feel like that's the view of a survivor of, tragedy or hardship, or the dissolution of the Soviet Union, or?
Well, it's an interesting question. There are a number of positions presented in the book in dealing with things like fate and forgiveness. I think Kotler is somebody who is a secular person, is probably more aligned with me as a secular person. I like to believe that there is this possibility for having a role in dictating or deciding what happens to your life. But he feels like he treads this line. He says, yes, as you say, you walk hand in hand in fate. Fate pulls in one direction, you pull in the other, and it's hard to tell who's leading who. Whereas Svetlana, who you meet, is a religious person. She's a Christian, and she's married to this Jewish man. And I guess we don't give too much away by saying what's made clear on the back of the book anyway, that her husband is the man who denounced Kotler to the KGB all those years before. And so the structure of the book, again, because it's given away in the back, it's not really a spoiler. It's a little bit of a spoiler, but believe me, if you just turn the back of the book over, it's all there. I wouldn't do it otherwise. The question of the book isn't if, but how, right? It's not will they meet. The question is how they meet. If it's plausible that such a thing can happen as you read it. And what's interesting is, okay, so they're going to meet. Then what? What happens when two men meet 40 years after the greatest decision of both of their lives that have dictated everything that happens to them from that moment forward? And so Kotler, is somebody who's trying to make sense of why he's ended up where he has. And Svetlana believes differently.
And that question of fate and of the potential for a seemingly chance act to change the course of your life had gotten me thinking of a story in your family's own emigration from Riga, which was a moment that landed you in Toronto.
Yes.
And can you tell that story?
The story that Michael is alluding to, because Michael knows me so well.
Is this okay for personal dissemination?
Yeah, my previous book dealt with this experience of Jews going through Italy and deciding where they were going to end up in the 1970s, 80s. And we were planning, my family thought we were going to go to Atlanta, Georgia. We didn't know anybody there. I have relatives here. The bulk of my family actually didn't end up in Toronto, but ended up in the Bay Area. Some of whom are here tonight. It's kind of like a second home for me. So, some of whom are arriving late right now. But what happened was my parents had gone to declare that they were going to go to Atlanta, Georgia, and the man who was acting on behalf of Hayas as an interpreter was a man my father had known in Riga in athletics, and he asked him, Emanuel Naumovich, where are you going? And he said, well, we're going to Atlanta. And he said, well, you must be crazy. Even people who we try to send to Atlanta don't want to go, and here you are going voluntarily. And he said, Canada has opened up. You have 10 minutes to decide literally. We didn't know anybody in Canada, and that was it. I suppose that is fate, a form of fate. My parents seized it, and they had their own rationalizations and reasons for doing it. Climate. This is gonna sound bizarre, but hockey, actually, because my father was a big sports fan, and he'd watched, as many people in the Soviet Union had watched, the Super Series, the Summit Series between Canada and Russia in 1972, and they'd seen things. They'd seen Canada. You saw some of Toronto and some of Montreal and Vancouver and Winnipeg, and it seemed very appealing, and that played a role.
Yeah. Well, your mother had told me that story, but in her version, you
yes,
you were the decider.
Well, Toronto was yes. So there was Canada, and then there's Toronto, where they asked us, well, where do you want to go? And I had a little friend in Italy, and I said, well, I want to go where he's going, in front of the, I guess who would have been the consular official, and they said, okay. Toronto was actually a place that was very tough to get into because everybody wanted to go there. And yeah, okay, go.
And I started thinking of fate because I'd said to her at the time, now that you're established there, that it must seem like fate, that these decisions sort of align to land you where you're supposed to be. And she told me there was a more powerful force than fate that made that happen, which was that as a child you were so irresistibly cute. That when you said Toronto, who could say no?
It doesn't work anymore. I wish it did.
But I do, and so I guess that how much are you? As I read the book, there are scenes that are so humanistic that they don't seem created, but they seem like they must be channeled from your own experience. So how much are you drawing on your own experience and your family's own path? I mean, there are obvious ways, but I think there are moments where there's the scene on the beach where the Kotler remembers going to the beach with his father, and that his father was so disciplined that he was sort of suspicious of leisure. And so when they would go to the beach, he would take this very systematic approach to it, which you don't sit, but you walk and you go in the water, and it's disciplined. And I was saying that reminded me of my own father in these ways that it seems so real. So how much are you drawing on that personal experience when you're working?
So this book, in the most superficial sense, resembles my life the least of all the books. I'm not Kotler. His story is not the story of my family. In every respect, there's really, we didn't go to Israel. I've never been a famous politician. And one of the challenges of writing the book was writing it from the perspective of a person who is highly virtuous. And has made sacrifices and moral decisions of a kind that most of us never make. And the challenge was coming to understand the psychology of a person like that, which is very different than my own psychology. Because as much as I would like to think of myself as an honorable person, I've never been tested in the way that he's been tested, and to understand his. So all of that is different from me. But there were elements, the example you bring up, definitely I draw from memories of my father, and other, Russian people that I know who, for whom going to the beach was like, you don't just go. You go, you have to go early, you have to get a place because somebody else is going to get the place. and then you walk for a while, you don't just lie there, then there's some walking you have to do. And then there's this whole system, and to be healthy, there's a right way to go about it, and when you have to go in the water, and then anyway. And I think that's something to do with an element of national character, which is also interesting to me. To say something in broad terms, that there is such a thing as a national character, which is not a very politically correct thing to say. But the question is there such a thing? So there are elements of that sort of thing where I draw from my own sentiment. I'm now I have children. I have daughters, 3 of them, and they're very little. But already having had children, writing about the experience of how one feels about children, that enters into it. I couldn't have written this book, quite the same way if I didn't have children. So those sorts of things, in a kind of subconscious way, or find themselves into the book, subliminal way find themselves into the book. But I think at the same time, for a reader, just as you very perceptively got it, it's like you feel the difference when all of a sudden it's this convergence of 3 things. It's a convergence between the character, the writer, and also the reader, where you all of a sudden understand that, oh, here's this thing that we all identify with. That this is the difference between, I think, what we would call literature and sort of genre writing, where there's some element of revelation and that point of convergence between these 3 things, where all of a sudden we kind of stand inside it and outside it at the same time.
And you mentioned writing about sort of a virtuous moral character. There's an opinion expressed toward the end of the book about moral characters, and it's expressed in the terms of saints. That a saint loves the world more than any one person, and that a man loves one person more than the world. And the thought then leads to the idea that a saint can only be with a saint. There's some sort of fundamental disconnection between the regular person and sort of the saint. And I think in this case, you can think of a saint as being a public figure or some sort of. And firstly, when I read that, I found myself thinking of the Clintons. And secondly, I think, what does that say about our public officials and our moral heroes? Because how often does great leadership go with personal failings? And is there do you feel like there's some sort of, moral vacuity or an ability to, because throughout, Kotler will make decisions that are much more pragmatic than sentimental, even as they affect people very close to him. So do you feel like there's some sort of necessary moral vacuity or lack of humanity that allows somebody to move big issues and not be hampered by kind of emotional, instinctual reactions of self-preservation or whatever they are?
So that's the other big question in the book, which is, as I said, why are some people highly principled? And it leads to what you're talking about, which is, if you become so committed to your principles, you become, for lack of a better word, public, like a saint, that there's a greater principle for which you realize you will sacrifice anything. And those are the people that we admire. I mean, the Clintons would not be my first analogy. But Mandela would be, or Gandhi would be, or Joan of Arc, or Hannah Senesh. I mean, like, there are just people who then we read about, and they are our heroes. But what makes them public and heroic is, I think, what would have made them terrible husbands and fathers, because what we look for from our parents is a commitment to us that supersedes everything else. And I think this is really the balance in speaking of being a parent too. It's a question of, at what point do I privilege my family over my principles and make compromises? And is that better or worse for them? Is it better for my children? Is it better for me, for instance, if I was Kotler, is it better for my children to see me not compromise and go to prison, and so they can, you hope, respect you and see that this is an honorable way to lead your life? Or is it worse when ultimately they say, well, so you've gone to prison for 20 years. You may have improved the world or you may not have improved the world, but we've had no life together. And I think most people will feel that pull, the sort of instinctive pull towards your children and your family to protect them first. And yet I think even as you do it, you will also be aware that you are compromising. And so you make a justification that way. Or if you're somebody like Kotler, you do it the other way, which is to honor your principles is the way to protect your family, ultimately. And you look beyond yourself. At a certain moment, he says, a man, he thinks about his people. There's a line where he talks about his children, and that he thinks about his children the way that God thought about the children of Israel, that he identified with them, even at their lowest, and that he knew them better than they knew themselves, and therefore he made decisions for them. And I think Kotler feels that way, that by not compromising his principles, even though he's depriving his children of a father in the conventional sense, he's saving the world for them. He's making the world a better place, which in the end will benefit them. Most people, I don't think, can do that. So that is interesting to me. And then the question becomes, well, now we've discussed it, we've framed the terms, but still, what enables him to do it? Why can some people do it and others not? And I think that was the other thing for me about writing the book, is not just asking the question, but also posing an answer to it. And I think, there's Israeli politics in this book. There's things to do with, Russia and Ukraine, which I think, depending on your politics or how you read it, could be seen very provocative or controversial. But to me, I think maybe the most controversial thing is the answer to this question, which is, why are some people more virtuous than others? And the answer that Kotler provides is, frankly, I couldn't think of a better answer. And I spoke to many people and tried to understand. I spoke to dissidents and tried to ask them, why did you do this? Mm-hmm. Right? You understood you understood that you wouldn't see your children. You understood that you were risking your own life. You understood that, you would be separated from your spouse. Why did you do this? And I kept getting more or less the same answer. And therefore, to me, I was like, well, that must be it. I couldn't think of a better answer.
And Kotler's, his sense of morality it's a fascinating aspect of the book. It does, as much as he's held as this paragon, it's a situational morality. He has the line where he says that something to the extent that right and wrong aren't fixed positions, they're extenuating circumstances. And I think there's I think that you have at the center of
Well, I will say at that moment, he's kind of mocking himself. He's saying that this is the way the world is. It's an element of sarcasm, right? When he's looking at Tankelevich, asking him for forgiveness and saying, why shouldn't I forgive him? Isn't the way of the world now that right and wrong aren't fixed marks, that we're supposed to believe that they're extenuating circumstances? He doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe it. He believes that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and that he finds himself in a world where increasingly it's a relativistic world, where people do say these things. And in that way, he finds himself in trouble a lot.
And he does seem to, I think that the world in which he finds himself does render him increasingly pragmatic. He's posed, someone close to him poses a question to him that he seems to answer as almost as a politician, as a public person.
Which is what?
With his son at the end, who has a duty, and what should I do?
Yeah.
And there's almost a guardedness that when he answers that question, he seems to me that he's answering it as a leader of people rather than as a father.
But I think that's him.
Yeah.
The question is, so for instance, just to get a better sense of the book, so he's left, right? There's the withdrawal from the West Bank settlement. He has a wife and he has 2 children, teenage children, a daughter and a son who's in the Israeli army. And the son is a religious Zionist, as a lot of people in the Israeli military are now. And his son also opposes the withdrawal. And he calls his father and he says, should I do this? And on religious grounds, his son believes he can't do it. The Torah says, this land is ours, God gave it to us, and we can't withdraw from it. And Kotler gives him a different answer, which is what you're alluding to. And his answer is, yes, I mean, it sounds like a politician's answer, but he's also a secular person. And his answer is, well, because his son says it's immoral. It's immoral because of the Torah to leave this land. Kotler's morality is different. He says, well, it doesn't say anywhere in the Geneva Convention that you can't evacuate your own settlements. So by secular laws, it's not immoral. You're not being asked to kill innocent people. So it's not immoral. And what he says to him is, if you can form a majority in the government, right, then do what you want. But for me to tell you that you should do this, frankly, you're a soldier in the military, and there are soldiers in the Israeli military who will say that the settlements are illegal and that they are unconscionable, and therefore they don't want to serve in the West Bank and function there. And there are other soldiers like his son who say, this land is ours by right from God, and therefore we must hold it at all costs. And Kotler basically says to him, you know, we can't function as a country like this. If you're a soldier, you're a soldier. You've been given orders. And soldiers can't just go off and believe and act however they choose based on their own personal principles. Israel's still a democracy. It's not the Soviet Union. If you're not happy with it, form the government. And that's not a satisfactory answer to his son, who says, you know, when it was your time as a young man and you opposed something morally and your soul said, absolutely not, at no possible terms will I do this, you behave differently. Now what am I supposed to do? And so this is a big part of the book as well. How should a person respond to his principles, or his or her principles? Kotler has his way, and his son, who's very much like him and admires him, says that. And Kotler says to him, well, you know what? Whenever you think there's no other choice, look again. Right? He says there's usually a second way or a third way, and you just have to have the strength of your convictions to follow that. And the son does. He does something else, which I won't give away. But that's, the way the book is structured, and I hope it feels organic, that it doesn't feel just schematic. Well, everybody's got a little problem, and, that everybody in this situation really has a big decision to make. I think it's a type of book that is much more possible to write about Israel and Ukraine than it is to write about America or Canada. Because if you can take a politician in the United States or Canada who takes, a strong position on something, usually they don't have skin in the game, right? How many people in Congress today or in the Senate have children who are serving in the military? Not a lot. So when they, go grandstanding, we should do this or we should do that, they're not paying the price themselves. But in a place like Israel, everybody's got skin in the game. And therefore, when we have these, moral decisions, it's not arbitrary. That's why I think I could write a book like this and it doesn't feel schematic, because it's true. Writers and politicians and public people who take positions in Israel, they have a big stake. David Grossman, lost a son in the 2006 Lebanon war. that's it. That's normal. And so it was interesting to me because I wanted to explore this moral component, which I think about a lot, but to do it, in an extreme situation. And I'm also interested in what's happening to Israel and what the future of Israel is and what the future of Russian Jews is, both in Israel and in what's left of them in the former Soviet Union. Therefore, it's like it enables this book to, I'd like to believe, realistically engage with all these things, because it's not just a game for these people in those places. It's not a game.
And as we only have a few more minutes, I wanted also to ask about the film Natasha, and what was it about that story that that compelled you to make a film?
So Michael's alluding, he knows that I've done an adaptation of the story Natasha. So there's the whole book Natasha, but there's the title story about the teenager who gets into this love affair with his nominal cousin, a girl who comes with her mother from Moscow, and she was involved in pornography in Russia. I mean, the story to me, I felt like I could see it cinematically. Enough happened. There was enough incident in it that could be opened up. And it was the one story that if you took that story from all the others, it happened in the midpoint of the book, and all the other stories could kind of filter into it. Whereas if you took something from the beginning of the book, it really wouldn't reflect all of it. Or if you took something from the very end, it also wouldn't reflect everything. It was that point where the family is still, they've just found some level of stability, right? They're very much immigrants and found some level of stability, but not completely settled in a way. And somebody, from the old country comes in and shakes their world again. So it was for that reason. I could see it as a story, and it was also situated in a way that I thought it would still address some of the larger themes of the whole book.
And then, I've worked with a lot of writers over the last decade, and I don't know that I've worked with another writer who's as intentional and in control of every decision and every element of your work. And how do you adapt that to being on set? I mean, which is organizing people and giving up that control.
I don't give up a lot of control.
I guess that's the answer.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as I can, if you work with great people, then you give up control when you see that they do something better than you. So you could take things up to a certain level where you feel comfortable, and you know that if I let this person, my production designer, go do something, I know he's going to be great. Or if my cinematographer, you develop a level of trust. But other than that, yeah, I pay as much detail as I possibly can, down to the delivery of lines of dialogue. I sit there with my sides and tick off when somebody said the word the right way on a take, so I know we've got that, and then,
And how do those two parts of your work kind of complement each other? I mean, writing and directing.
In a very sort of experiential sense, in a existential sense, it's like writing is a lonely business, and I like people sometimes, and I like to change the rhythm up. I think it's healthy for me if I just I'm alone writing all the time. I find that I just really am isolated and isolate myself, and so I like that just as a way of living, to work with other people. And other than that, I think it's much the same. It's just trying to tell stories that are important to me, just in different modes.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad we have something to look forward to next year in the film.
have any questions? Okay.
We have one
Start with
right in
this
front.
right up front.
Hi, I have a question related to the main character and whether or not in doing the research about the main character you had spoken with other people about maybe their backgrounds as a, or if you considered the characters parental instructions or experience as a child that would provide the fodder for creating him a sort of superior moral character, and what elements you would have considered or explored in other people that you discussed their backgrounds with that might have had an influence on the people that they became.
So you're talking about Kotler in this book.
And also the people that you interviewed to try and ask them, you know, what were they thinking when that happened? I mean, did you speak with any of them about, you know, what were the experiences they had that gave them the strength and or guidance to sort of make choices as they did?
Yeah, absolutely. So the character of Kotler, I think people who are kind of familiar with the history of the Refusnik movement, the Soviet Jewish movement, would identify him as modeled as a close model on a man named Natan Sharansky, which he is, up to a point. Sharansky's never had a mistress and all these things, and he never went to Yalta to meet this woman, but and to meet encounter the man who betrayed him. But I was interested in him. I never spoke to him or his wife or his family. I deliberately didn't want to do that. But I did go to Israel, for instance. I was very interested to talk to former prisoners of Zion, Yosef Mendelevich, and I'm trying to remember all the names. I'm terrible at that. Anyway, it's in the back of the book. I thank them all. And talk to them about it. I had two questions that interested me. One is, what was the experience like of resisting Soviet power? What was that like? Why did you do it? And in talking to them, I also tried to establish how firm they were. And some people were, very firm, meaning that they felt like, I didn't give an inch at all. But there was no hubris in it, never. They said, we recognized that even the people who broke down, we understood them, right? There's the least level of judgment in that community because they knew exactly what people were facing. So I was interested to talk to them about that. And the other thing I was interested to hear from them was how they felt about Israel. Having sacrificed everything they'd sacrificed, for some of them, the best years of their lives, and then coming to Israel and not necessarily having an easy time of it to begin with, and struggling to survive and to find their place in the country, to see how they felt about the country now. And I would say, to a person, they were very strong Zionists. I didn't meet anybody who questioned their decision to do it. There's a woman named Ida Nudel who's a little different. I didn't get a chance to talk to her as much as I would have liked. But that was that. And where they fell on the political spectrum was interesting to me. And I think most of them fell on the right of the political spectrum. Some of them lived in, parts of, depending on your politics, Judea and Samaria or the occupied territories or whatever you want to call it. So there was that. That was interesting to me. And I spoke to an Iranian dissident. I was living in Boston and asked him the same question. It's like, what is it that made you do it? Did you understand what was happening? Did you understand that you would not see your wife and your daughters? Yes. And he talked about other Iranian dissidents and the idea behind it. Yeah.
I hope you don't mind me changing the subject just for a moment. I really enjoyed your story about Natasha. And as somebody who used to be in the theater, I'm wondering Well, first of all, is it going to be a Canadian production? Is it going to be an American production? And how did you go about casting the actors for that, including the character of Natasha?
So the challenge of the Natasha film, which was shot in Canada primarily with Canadian actors, but it's 80% in Russian. So it's a foreign language film shot in Canada, and the reason for that is because of the way the story is. So you have this 16-year-old kid who's growing up now in Canada, and it's the summer, and this girl comes, and she doesn't speak any English, and it's the summer, so there's no school for her, there's no place for her to go, and he's the only person who she can interact with, and he has to speak Russian to her because she doesn't speak any English. Well, once you do that, you have a Russian language film. Right, most of the time they're together, and when he's at home with his parents, well, then they'd be speaking Russian, and the grandparents, well, they're speaking Russian, and there you go. It's 80% Russian language film. The actors I say they're Canadians, but some of them are people with Canadian passports that now live in Israel, and are, act in Israeli theater or anyway. What I wanted was for it to be completely authentic. So there are no Polish people playing Russians, right? It's in that sense, it feels like a foreign film. And there are no accents, there's no nothing. And the girl, she was very difficult to find because she needed to be a number of things. One is she needed to have fluent Russian. 2, she needed to look young enough to play kind of 14 and yet be older than 14, right? At least 18. 3, the reason for that is because there's a lot of sexual content in the film, and I didn't want to soft pedal it. So there's sex in the movie and there's nudity. And 4, she had to be a great actress. Oh, and 5, she also had to look Slavic, not Jewish. Because that plays a role in the film. So I basically needed a really good, blonde, Russian-speaking woman who could play 14 and be comfortable with sex. How many actors? For Canada and the U.S., it's not a very large pool. I mean, it is in a sense. We cast in Israel too. And the fact is, what I've discovered, I don't know if you've discovered this in dealing with films as well, no matter how many actors you test, you discover there's only one that's right for the part. You could see 100 people, but it's, in my experience, there's only one who's right for it.
I'm interested in hearing about Victoria Day ever since I saw that you had made a film, because I enjoyed Natasha so much, and I have been trying to find that film, and it's not distributed. It's been in my Netflix queue for about 5 years.
I know. Yeah. It's a funny thing. The film did not get distribution outside of Canada, and in a world where it seems like you can get anything online and you can see what's out online, the borders are still pretty firm that way. And it's frustrating, but that's the reality of it. I mean, so I hope in time things will change and it'll pick up some kind of distribution, but at this point it's if you're not in Canada, you're going to have a hard time finding it. I hope that won't be the case for Natasha, and I'm fairly confident it won't be. Yes.
Hi. I was wondering if you mentioned I know that there's the opposite kind of character. The opposite of Kotler is Tankelevich. And I was wondering if you could talk about him and how you feel, I guess, personally, because this is a new, as you said, new territory for you. How is Tankelevich new territory for you too, or is he?
So the opposite to Kotler is Tankelevich, who's the man who betrayed him, who denounced him. And the way the book is structured, you start with Kotler up to the point where he encounters Tankelevich, and then the book kind of stops and rewinds, and then you spend several chapters from Tankelevich's point of view. The origin behind the book was I was researching something and I found what I found a very curious historical footnote, which is that Sharansky was betrayed by a friend, this man, Sanya Lipovsky. And what I was curious about was, what does it mean to betray your people and your friend for a country that later ceases to exist? And you continue. And what is your life like? It was harder for me to get into Kotler's head than Tankelevich's head. Tankelevich, I understood more because I think he's like an ordinary person, more like. You say what? Did somebody say what? Did I hear a what? Oh, it was a zipper. Okay. Yeah, I think in a totalitarian state, whether it's East Germany or the Soviet Union or wherever, you had many people who were denouncing each other. Some of them because there was something wrong with them. Most of them because they just felt under pressure and couldn't resist. That is effectively Tankelevich's position. So him I understood. And he also gave me an opportunity to present something that interests me, which is the end of Ashkenazi Jewry, right? The end of this 1,000-year-old, very influential, rich history, which is now coming to an end, and we see it before our eyes. Anybody who goes to the former Soviet Union sees these communities that existed that are now dwindling. And it was interesting to me to be alive at the end of this cycle and to see it. And Tankelevich represents that. You know, he and people of his generation are the last, what we understand conventionally as Ashkenazi Jews, right? And so this is, and at the heart of the book, there's also this question, which is what is the future? If it's the end of Ashkenazi Jewry and European Jewry, right? If that's coming to an end, which I argue it is, and Israel is at a moment where there are some questions too about its future and what direction the country will take, which I think those questions are being asked more acutely now than they ever have been before. You can say rightly or wrongly, doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is they are. What is the way forward? What is the way forward for Jews? And Kotler and Tankelevich provided the opportunity for me to explore those questions, which I think are very pressing questions, and questions that mean a lot to me.
Thank you. So in one of your stories, from the Natasha stories, there's an interesting couple of lines where the main character, who's a young boy, says the members of the Jewish community came to the synagogue because they were nostalgic for Jewish customs. I came because I was nostalgic for old Jews.
Yes.
And so reading that collection and finishing The Free World, I was struck by your interest and kind of deep perceptiveness about Russian Jews of the older generation. And I was just wondering, especially people like Samuel Lazarevich or Roidman, or the potentially homosexual couple as well in Natasha and other stories. And I was wondering if you could say a couple of words about the origin of that interest. What draws you to kind of the elderly community, elderly generation?
Sure. So the people who are the older generation in Natasha and the Free World, those people are basically dead now, right? They were really the last. I mean, when you look at people like Kotler and Tankelevich, they're born at the time of the Second World War. To be 70, 75 years old now means that you were born under Soviet power. You didn't fight in the war, right? You were a child. So my grandparents, for instance, were Yiddish speaking, because we were Baltic Jews, it's a little different, so they had this period where they weren't under Soviet power, so that, there were still the traditions, the Jewish traditions were still alive. Yiddish-speaking Jewish traditions, they'd lived through the war, they'd lived through the Holocaust, all these things that we identify typically and conventionally as Jews, right? Russian Jews. That's who those people were. And I really saw the end of not just of a generation, but of a kind. When those people died, they are not replaced by anyone else. They're because the world that created them also doesn't exist anymore. And that's why I was attracted, because these are people that I loved and I felt deeply for them, and it was just sad. I've married into a family that are American, and my father-in-law's here, and my brother-in-law's here, and I look at my wife's side of the family, who are Americans going back several generations, and there's a level of envy for me, because we were living in Boston, and my mother-in-law took this trip with my wife and our daughter to Vermont to look at a family house, the Johnson house. I can't do that. This idea of continuity, and with my grandparents, that was the end of it. And so part of what I was doing, part of my project was memorializing, because I was the last sort of witness who could kind of understand it, be part of it and not part of it at the same time. My children will have to try to explain to my children what my grandparents were. I think it's an almost impossible project, right? So by virtue of being alive when I was alive and wanting to write, this is one of the things that I felt that it was incumbent upon me to do. I mean, we saw, I haven't read it yet, I've pieces of it, but the book that came out recently by, Boris Fishman, right? Right, Replacement Life. Same sort of, right? I think it springs from the same sort of feeling, right? He and I are roughly the same generation, and I think it's inspired by the same sort of feeling.
I have a couple of related questions, so you can pick right one. You talked about your relations with your characters, and about your mental control. So should you give up? So have you? Do you feel you have to give up some level of control at one moment, or you control your characters, or do they behave totally independently? And a related question would be, so most of your characters are Russian speakers.
Yeah.
And if, here we can, I think you have to answer this question a lot. So do you position yourself as a writer, as a Russian-speaking English writing writer? So part of this cohort.
Yes.
Or if, for example, you would pick, you would love, or are you planning to pick a totally different character, and who would it be? So if it's not a Russian-speaking character or Jewish character,
Yes.
would it be someone totally different?
Right.
Thank you.
So to the first question, I have a design for the book. I have a design for the characters, but this is, for me, 220 pages is a big book. It's 50,000 words. It takes me a long time to write. I don't know every word that's going to come. What I have to know is the mentality, the psychology of the characters, to understand how they'll answer any question. If they'll answer yes or no, I have to understand them. Right? Somebody asks them something, I should know if this is the sort of person that'll say yes to that or no to that. Beyond that, things happen through the course of writing that aren't, entirely predetermined. To the second question, how I position myself, I mean, I don't position myself anyway. I just write what I write. One gets positioned, and that's fine. I don't make a big deal out of it. And writing a non-Russian, non-Jewish character, I will say that, you know, these 3 books I look at as part of one project, right? These 3 books together, where I felt like there were things I wanted to say about this Russian, ex-Soviet Jewish community, and I feel I've said them. I have no further plans to write about this community of people, simply because I can't find anything new to say that's of interest to me. I may write a story or something, but this is it. The first book, Natasha, I wanted to write because at that point, nobody had really written about this community. It was starting to happen. Gary Steingart published like a little bit before that. So there was that idea. And the Free World was this bigger project about who are these Soviet Jews, where do they come from, and this very peculiar, and I found interesting, moment in Italy, where you have all these people, Soviet people, all of a sudden finding themselves in the West, in Italy of all places, and trying to figure out where they're going to go, which I always found interesting. And this book was to be as current and contemporary as possible, to say, okay, right now, what is the greatest impact that these people have had, this, you know, collective community of people, and where is it? And the answer to that is Israel. And it's, in a way, the answer to that is also the former Soviet Union, where they are not anymore. By virtue of their absence, they've changed that country, or those countries. And by virtue of their presence, they've changed. Yes, you can feel their influence a little bit in North America, but nowhere as in Israel. They've transformed that country. And because they've transformed that country, they've transformed the direction of that country. And since so many people, Jewish and non-Jewish people, seem to care about the direction of that country, I think you can't account for it without understanding what the Soviet Jews, the ex-Soviet Jews, have done. And the role and the influence they continue to play. So if you care about, you know, Israel and the Middle East, you should understand who these people are, because it's a crazy thing. I mean, it's a country of immigrant that absorbed immigrants, but over a period of about 10 years, they absorbed 1/6 of their population, right? Imagine that. It's like imagining that the United States would absorb 50 million immigrants in 10 years. Something like that. My math is not perfect, but you know what I'm talking about. It's a crazy thing.
I think, last question right over here.
Can I grab it? Okay. Thank you very much for what you are doing. I am reading what you are writing. I am reading works of other writers. You mentioned Steingart, Lara Wapniar, this new writer by the name Fishman, other people. So you are all people of certain generation. You actually did not experience Soviet life. At the same time, you are presenting it, summarizing it as collective experience for the audience. I've been to gatherings like that few times before. It seems to me that most of the audience are American people with high percentage of Jewish American people of certain age. It seems like this is the audience, target audience, so to speak.
It's not the target audience.
It's not, but de facto it becomes.
It's the audience. It's who reads books, we could say, or of a certain kind. Of a certain kind. Anyway, go on. Yeah, go on.
Good compliment, well taken by the audience. Question is, how about the Russian Jews of that generation about whom you are writing? What is their response to what you do?
Okay.
How do they feel? How authentic you present it? Because it's their life. It's not really yours.
Okay. So I'll take a small liberty and assume that you're not Peruvian. Okay. You can answer the question. You answer the question. How do you feel about this stuff? Does it feel to you authentic? Does it feel, go, yeah.
I'll give you an example, and we will talk about you, because, yeah, no, about you as a writer.
Go ahead. Yeah.
To my taste, you have you write architecturally. You use blocks of writing, you think about that, and also there is a masculine aspect to your writing. Do you mind moving a little bit? That's why your statements come strong. For example, you several times tonight you made a statement about Jewish life dying over there. We both come not from Peru, so we know what we are talking about. And I am from Kiev, from Ukraine. So the funny thing is the Jewish community of Soviet Union is today second largest Jewish community in Europe after France. The place still has 200,000 to 300,000 Jews. And actually, life of Jewish community in large cities in Ukraine is very vibrant, but in a very strange way. And I don't think that any of you guys covering it, because you give this strong nostalgic feeling that it's totally dying. Meanwhile, it's actually metamorphosing itself into something completely different.
Very good. Into what?
That's a different story, because it's a living project. It's like for me to ask you what you will write next.
No, it's not. It's not entirely. It's not entirely. So, you look at Ukraine, and I agree with you. I'm not unaware of this, okay? You look at where I went in Crimea, okay? Simferopol, Feodosia, okay? Those cities, Yalta, what are the others? There are a few others. There's not much in Kerch. There's a little bit in Kerch. Anyway, it's over, okay? It's over there. If you read the book, they do say, there's a woman who runs the Hesed. She says, we're not Odessa and we're not Dnipropetrovsk, okay? We need help. Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk are a little different. Dnipropetrovsk is a weird place, totally, okay? But yeah, it has a Jewish community. A lot of it has to do with Chabad, okay? Which has its own project there. What is the future going to be there? It's a good question. I still believe, and you have people going from Israel and coming back to Ukraine, and there's all sorts of things are happening. But even if we say there are 200,000 or 300,000 Jews in the former Soviet Union, okay? How many did there used to be, let's not even say 80 years ago, because that would be a very big number. Let's say 30 years ago. We had a couple million? A couple million and 200,000, that's a big difference, okay? I think to all extents and purposes, what we identify, what we're familiar with as Ashkenazi Jewish life is over. You can say it's not over, it's metamorphosizing into something else. And who knows, maybe there'll be some kind of change, but it would have to be, frankly, a tragic change to bring that life back. Because it means those Jews would have to come from somewhere else to go back there. You can argue with me, which is fine. That's what I'm saying. I'm aware there's some Jews in Moscow. I'm aware there's a community in Kiev. I'm aware Dnipropetrovsk, absolutely. But it is different. And I would stand by my statement that for most people traveling through Europe, you spend more times in cemeteries than anywhere else. And that is not, to me, a living Jewish community. That's fine. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say. I invite you to
I think
I'm just curious. Let him say, yeah.
So what you identify as Ashkenazi, and it's a specific story because Russian Jews,
Russian Jews, yes.
Your parents, me,
yeah.
they were secular Jews.
Yes.
The rejuvenation which is happening now for the first time since before revolution, is happening on the basis of Jewish religion, which was completely removed. And rejuvenation of in Jewish history based on religion shows based on religious experience in various places.
Yes.
Even though cemeteries are always big.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Shows very strong tenaciousness. It can be much stronger phenomena than you and me think. I came to this country 20 plus years ago. When I came to this country, based on this statistic you just presented to audience, it was 3 million, 10% left. I thought in 20 years there would be nothing to talk about. Actually, vibrancy and everything else increased dramatically against all odds.
I still think it's a limited type of religion. Even speaking of religion, the religion that used to exist in, it's generational. It has to do with, the Haskalah, like all these things. It resembles much more what we see as religious, insofar as there's religion in American Judaism that is not like modern Orthodox, but like most secular Jews. Yeah, it would be like that. How strong are those bonds? How much do those people really know about Jewish religion? How much of that will they be able to transmit to the next generation? I don't think it's that much. I don't think it's that much, frankly. Without, then I'll go off on a totally different spiel that has to do with how important it is to have a Jewish language, if you're secular people, but it's a different thing. I concede your point. It's not that there's nothing, but I think you can't put your faith in it in a way that you could have put your faith in this like 2 million plus community of Jews. And I wish them well. I really do. But my experience of going to those places is kind of a sad experience, I'll be honest with you. I'm mostly seeing things either that are gone, or I'm seeing people make an effort that I realize is I don't want to say a futile effort, it's not futile, but it seems to me an effort that is fated not to succeed. And that's sad. And because they're well-intentioned and they really try, and they're limited in resources, and it's just, you want to do more for them. And I think they're also, to a large extent, American Jews don't think about them that much, and they're kind of forgotten. So they're fending for themselves, and anyway, that's my experience. I wish I could go there and walk away feeling like, man, this is awesome. This is like a great renewal and a rejuvenation, and this is really going to work out. Maybe that's my own personality too, right? Maybe I'm a somewhat pessimistic sort, but I'm Jewish.
So I want to thank all of you for coming out and the really amazing questions, and thank the JCC for hosting this night. Thank you to David.
Thank
for
you,
Hey,
my friend.
this was great.
Yeah.
So David will be, the Books Inc., which is a wonderful local bookseller, is selling copies of the new book in the back, and David will be signing them. So please stick around and pick up a copy, and thank you again.